Hello, my name is Michael, and this is Bore Me to Sleep, the series dedicated to helping people sleep. More specifically, this video will lull you to sleep by boring you with unintelligible nonsense. For this episode, I'll be using vocabulary and sentence structure that vaguely emulates a lecture on Roman history. If you find Roman history boring, then this video is for you. If you really enjoy Roman history, I would actually suggest listening to a different episode with a topic you have a harder time paying attention to. I've used machine learning to generate a monologue that doesn't make much sense in order to provide you the same comfort as falling asleep in a lecture. Please don't try to understand the script. Many people enjoy falling asleep to videos like this, but some can't as the material is too interesting. The words I say will vaguely pertain to the subject, but will be fragmented enough where a meaning can't be found. The effect created is a boring lecture where you can't understand or pay attention even if you wanted to. Therefore, I suggest you get comfortable and try to sleep. Let the words wash over you and let your mind drift. If this video helps you do that, please consider supporting. Liking, sharing, and subscribing help these episodes reach other people that need them. By the way, Bore Me to Sleep is ever evolving, and I'm continuing to dial in my delivery, cadence, and overall sound. I try to make myself sound boring in these episodes, so let me know what you think. Ultimately, this project is for you, so your feedback is hugely appreciated and will be used for continuous improvement. Also, for those who enjoy a little extra ambiance, episodes are uploaded alongside an alternate version with added background music. Some people find soft music or atmospheric sounds help them relax even more, so that option will be available. I will now begin the lecture, so please enjoy and sleep well. Defeat at first Roman forces in time in Spain, and the survivors following Roman army. The Second Punic War and the struggle after the end of the war. In the 3rd century, the Senate also came to assume the memory of the Germanicus. His law was to be chosen to Vespasian assassination by 2 senators, membership in the same, all that they were unable to the area, as the Senate of the young Marius was to Marius, the son of his wife Tarquinius, on him. It was to all 2 who would be faced authority in early political life. Thus, would have the law of this practice, however, a few other tribes were not able to advance into an oath, and any other to vote. Even so, city through its leading families may have been dependent upon in the poor and military leaders were thought to accept such a defining and substantial force with their conduct. Sometimes communities in a considerable manner within of which they were not accepted to secure the same way to help, and me such that the consuls of office would be thought in office, and the office of office and the right of most powerful officials. The reforms required of these wealth well to be senators and equities, and created how such as they were to use it now in the imperial cult. This could be sure that the practice of law, the first part of Roman state, was not by a desire for a crisis, and to favored in Sicily, they could order it had been a major collection of taxes in Rome. At the point of the Roman army assembled in order that had been specified beyond the existing 30 years. In the following year, the Second Punic War had Roman officials of the province and the city of itself. That it was to be further Roman height as, then some success a Roman would be divided ruler. For example, huge building, a 4 for a single 4 years of our sources. This family was less than once. Eventually, however, many of his official actions were formidable. When senators and soldiers, who were the first of life to death, in such a form and villages arranged by the Senate for centuries, plebeians first all alliances with much of their own city-states, Greek cities ones with the Samnites, and most powerful states both were now able to share the new communities, as well as a result of private citizens and whole families could be held such freedom for a single year. The large prominent members of the elite came from Italy and some Italian communities in the number of the made cities that could only settle to former praetors and other enemies and their enemies. Only a few evidence from this period were added to us. The calendar was to settle and war by the war. Meantime, the revolt was high in his Tiberius, and his hold of the year Gaius Gracchus had been a battle at the north meeting of southern Campania. He was a major one captured by the laws through Roman commanders, as Caesar to be done so the period now in Rome. When this result, the Romans would build the most expanded of kings. These military services themselves gained in fashion and existence. At the assignment of the penalties of the highlands to indicate that debt could not be seeked, to determine the most officials for its remaining dictator. At the same time, it was elderly senators who tried to use his favor at Tiberius Caesar in 100. To make this early famous mid-century second, after a Roman forum in Greek cities within the south of the south, had military leadership. On the next side of the 2nd century, a high point, which had been so, had to be elected as his successor when the new leader was put into office of a consul. Most tribunes would be a consul for his colleague in 100. So Antonius was set to be ready for the 12th assignment of the 5 legions Maidet, and to hire the men had to reach members of the military elite. A wide importance city may have been tantamount. There is no doubt, however, that previously the Roman Republic did not want to be the legal display of the city Quintus, who had defeated a Roman province. He was returning to his brother the command of 2 legions in Gaul, and fighting against the next spring of his early 3rd century. Our sources we have contributed so that they and the Romans unsettled some of the elite and their followers for long. When this example in Plutarch wrote Dionysius of the 2nd century spread to the imperial cult of the Italian peninsula. By the early 2nd century, the former was responsible for chief of the same. Much less fortunate to this shift in Rome is now. Almost certainly, not the public consuls who have been assigned to them by others. Instead, the responsibility raised armies thought to place Tiberius to these during the south of the Principate. But it was much from there as the Senate, as a body, as a consequence of the Senate to command the plebeians to take the chance of, to change land and this settlement eventually in practice. However, his strong commitment to the Senate, as a law passed that the tax collecting them was not to be elected often required to vote. Once Sulla called his followers' census to take command against the new inhabitants of the city population, and they would bring the right to hand their payment there, were a longer, so that they did not know the Carthaginians to make their old place their official, the necessary means ready to be the duties to Caesar, who could be supported by new proposals. These Roman assemblies, however, less than the same time here as extreme ones of slaves. Therefore, the census of one another consul could be performed by the tribunes of the plebs in the entire land that would be set for such a great. The other issue of now Augustus, also the death in 23 years. In the years he could successfully sought to force the Senate. Even so, when he tried to successfully persuade some good hope of the Sextus Pompey, as though in any of the divisive war against the end of the century, the Flaccus was the most of Syria and the beginning of the century. In the 3rd century, city-states had been made to defeat, comprised a few of the Romans made more as Roman social class. The new cities were founded by the city that Caesar was likewise to be elected in time. In a single 5 years, one would say, that consequently a consulship consul could or be. Defeat in 237, it became the right of any citizen who through these citizens could not want to vote if it had been. This purpose Augustus intended to be favored a local problem on the emperor. When the emperors were a female warrior most prominent emperor, Rome often a shrine to the right known because of their numbers were to display. The Senate met with a formidable array of problems in the imperial cult. The social war and was effort to make what had been declared a large province of Gaul for the province. He had no steps towards the army to Italy without the military invasion of Gaul Africa, which had defeated in the Romans, and it would bring the Romans to the gods to be kept for one. All military women, as the holdings which would seem down of the emperor, the senatorial and the equestrian orders of the rule. It is the most ancient of these authors that said the most prominent Greek state of Roman civil wars. Naturally, his career leading citizens were in the law. The figure of this can be of a curved staff, or of the same time to give his imperial power and return to the city. In particular, the consuls were to act to death, raised Tiberius and in Sicily. By the end of the Punic War, the Romans also ordered their own funds at this battle. They had not long after much the debate about the women. On the same time, the consuls were against them too. Even eventually, however, we may not have been by Cicero, but by Claudius, was put by a popular support among senators. Rivalry between the Senate had to restore the new province of the province of Rome. In 1602 was a further triumph in Rome. Later, the Senate only met, the which may have been eventually in Gaius, and the men proceeded to off the city and to live the voting in order to vote. There is unlikely to know when he came to reflect the single senator Gaius Gracchus, but he died then at her own down. The grade of his loyal as his first returned in Gaul, in the east of modern Rome. In the Second Punic War, Roman officials and Italians with their own allies. The Romans had a long remainder of the city to the city. The more of central control in its cities, once Rome was the process of Roman citizens to Roman citizens who have been so many of close, there were established some publicani for new states. In the commander of the island of percent of the army, when he was consul in Rome, a villa he was left Rome in Rome, and won. He did locations west to the Senate, and the established political group of the past Roman officials of the city population did not want any specific consequence of Italy, and to the state they were its best and political order to its citizens. In the same year, or after all served as consul army, once Rome became a consul himself. The main focus of office, that praetors were the right of office more officials to vote and their power. In practice, first to this office was a certain on the first time of the 35 tribes Pompey had increased to supply forces, and finally him to be had been sent a city central to govern the city. In all, however, the Senate, the leading members of them no former office holders, who would take up a stand for any office, and soon after, all other there were defeated at the rebellion in Gaul. After a major Roman soldier who entered some Rome armies at the time, both in Italy, closed imposing among Trajan and other regions, this was it possible in a province. As it was confirmed that the Roman citizens had not been defeated in Roman dominion, a consul Rome began in the second and these centuries. Centuries, moreover, in the Roman Senate house could not only office too, the more they were expected to be in these series of provincial taxes, if their attendance could be if at least he could likewise not secure, but one of his family. It was a clear that one anyone made by a few patron to be the praetor. In the next elected he was a major lesser known as the Roman emperor, and families were their own men who had been able to hold the army. One of the consuls or other consular powers were held each, and with their office, moreover, they would be senators and much less who had such executions. The degree of any more than war with each other was that date of the military elite could have been settled in the infantry and centuries of the Greek, and one of the city of the gods, he was defeated. Many of them seemed for the serious threat to be whom most distinguished paid by the Roman state, defeated at the near of the kind of the Eastern War campaigns in Rome and Asia. The Romans had a less well to be seen and the cavalry when he supposedly as he appeared on their pass Tiberius, and the Senate met in the city of Rome in Asia, minor as well as they are in the last time that they are the Romans. A relatively large number of centuries that remained away from those elected in the city came to their surroundings, it and to trade. Our letters are no military respect for concern, because the continuation of now all be aside. In Sulla onwards, Rome, he had developed one of the public life. The men itself was annual festival to the public of the army, and defeated the city as many as the seat of the central, and the goddess of the new kingdoms beyond the Italian cities. The great majority of Rome itself, the city had escaped. This result the city had not expected to be so often decided to Greece, or so far from altogether to suffer from Rome itself. During the first centuries, the valley of the third century and the Samnites also took the peace of the province. Here was an assembly of Rome itself, to the traditional Latin city, may have been opposed to let alone or more. On a long other hand, had been intended to winter quarters from troops. After the fact of his death, and immediately the first came to the high stage of 3. This office each year was not annual. Once Rome previously was an entire region, extensive state to the cities of Asia. But one of the limited, however, was that the only known of Rome itself, permanent divided the war. The Romans towards war and Sicily in their long term, and others who came from their own funds or less bound in their territory. In times and other offices, these were indifferent to be no tribune in Lucius. Even though Claudius was one to be hard in the ill successful at the time, at the same time in the second war, with the Senate that the two consuls and praetors still compete, for with the campaigns of a major way that followed men to locally from a consul. Our surviving accounts of this period are not only speeches and philosophical and opinions yet to become emperor. You know that the most important law of these, however, at that date, this was not certain, office holders in any case. By these demands, as essentially had demonstrated by the sense that of Roman rule, the same consul and its election may have been the previous with such, along for the Greek word for the Romans also. Allies were hard to make able control, and more prolonged. The third was the Roman army to Marius, a membership in Roman law. But one of all his own men he was able to find the normal with 12. Even so, with that, Caesar was the strength of the city. Cicero was no step further, for a dispute for any regard, to be on the land himself. Made to the full return of the Roman world, it was proved more to be. The theatre of part of the province of the southeast of his. His name was said to have been a center of the future, which he never be called in the 7 times that he would still be normal for a year. Cicero felt favored by his son, by his men, and from the family. He then proceeded to lead where the city and the mountains, which had their unwavering ambition from any other commander. 100 by in the general that Cicero had high, almost a personal victory. He would be just as a third opening, the past mid-4th century, a new religion had been the most of the successful. One Romanian commander had their own force to build a civic command of the Tiberius, and he knew what he had sent no better of them to land in a province of Asia Minor. But in the early 3rd century, Rome and Senate had to have been granted. When the outcome was done in the early 3rd Samnite War, with a period that only be modified in the Civil War. After the following year, death in the Roman Senate had a long, but this could not be kept in time to be. The time is to demonstrate a formidable that Marius was not kept. In 48, after 89, was an uprising in the 3rd century. A law with it need be, a sign of the relationship with the Senate sought to him, and Senate and people. In their cases, he had determined too of the Augustus, the transformation of the reforms. As soon, however, Thus, in a few instances, at least 60 years in time, by the end of the 3rd century, the Romans took their lead in the city, and land had also been inherited from Macedonian war in Greek cities of Sicily. Some later would be found in Roman political and cultural life. Many, as few families were more concerned in more than the political. In addition, to be sure, he had made such an offer to office of all. In the 2nd century, it is the Senate carried on by my leadership, and it was not permitted to any assembly or vote in the north. This would be the 3rd war. Some from Italy came from one time by outside the sea between the city of the Italian peninsula, often as the son of his victory. The birth in the 3rd century at both Cato the sons of the most imperial family. This legislation is better seen like Pliny, the first settlement in the 2nd century. His successors expanded in some of the two of them, although some had little or been no longer term. At the same time as his plebeian, the right is said to have a new issue of the birth, to be the image and a commander of the army. The Carthaginians apparently hoped in a regular Octavian term, arranged for all, but his new political order was generally welcomed in the beginning of Rome itself. Once later, Roman power established colonies and the empire established in the Republic. Their whole role in the Roman politics was often some of the local problems as well, as most of the time. Successful, however, it is the Latin term for the Latin communities of Rome. Here were almost certainly expected the kind of conflict over the early 3rd century, and enabled them to have been no longer office for one or assembly. Even so, as Saturninus to these legislation was a God sentence, may be limited to the temple of the building, and centuries which often would be long enough where the elaborate 4th century lasted. Century is generally in the region of centuries. However, when Augustus instituted in many of his activity, in consequence, the cause was largely established by Greeks. Later required first arrangements in their own early in the century. In the 3rd century, the cult of the city history and its circumstances, because many Roman armies had been able to maintain a King Tarquinius on a litus. A result the Senate found in its colonies towards west. There were no more than military sources for the first established in Roman officials, and it did return to Roman arrangements. Some of the citizens were elected men from those who free men and killed. Not expect to hold any principle of his men, he was concerned to make his obligation to control. His colleague in office, he now invaded the province of Asia in the south. In his 5th century had been carried a larger open chamber of one of the consuls and praetors. Each citizen entered office or consul in such a way would rule to be raised, and they made it from the end of its people. Although some versions of these proposals, the aspects of the devastation in our resources are, for example, at this time, Roman concern to Pompey Caesar, but also brought back to Italy. He offered the end of their old Roman activities, and after a community or led to a permanent independence. The period of allies in the centuries of Italy, which had long been 20 years, during the second half of the 2nd century, the Romans were still priests and priestesses of the cult status of central Italian roads. Some of its own family members were the greatest and Latin cities of the most Latin and its southern Spain. But Roman expansion would have two most Roman cultures were also successful during the 1st century. However, in the German tribes, seems to have been the lead in the 6th century as centuries. Soldiers, especially prominent Romans, sought to display to a study by Latins who had isolated themselves and their very much less than long. Romans had ended all the number of pirates to their provinces. These also known as the use of and whole are common cults and marked general public. At the great battle, they defeated the defeated warfare Roman protection. In pursuit fighting then, was in fact during the summer of Gaius Gracchus, on this law which he gained enforced by the patrician family, in the city of and of Rome. At the same time, he did not share violence providing men to the land, with the chance to be binding and on the state. The Senate also assigned the most of its wars which wished. Almost the 4th early 2nd centuries and the Senate attempted generally welcomed in the city of its smaller orders. All this was the regular feature of a few families, the inhabitants of the Greek cities now built around 500. These cities suffered, and for the cavalry, in the early 3rd and the 2nd centuries, prosecutions for official festivals could only then at the same time. But in all likelihood the arrangements for its purpose was to be modified again on the Greek city on Rome and the coastal cities. Its prestigious priests and priestesses would also have been as the imperial cult stated. When Roman leaders were lines in public duties with the Greek city of Rome, its own family now defied Julius Caesar, and the Senate a new name was ever. Last, but the Senate lacked the office of the First Punic War, and they established their followers then, one of the Romans who had their popularity, but in the other cities, and were then to exercise his Anthony, what, in practice, a victorious military, and others came to have themselves. The two men came from the use of Italy, for example, can be more common. In all likelihood, the text remains an important phenomenon now took us now. Yet none, on the other hand, had little to be no surprise that no single senator permitted to take up his public life in Rome. As princeps, after this son had a large number of his Augustus, had begun at the end of the First Punic War and the opening decade of the 4th and 3rd centuries of the wars that Cleopatra took place in the year. But not least, this pawn was a Roman woman with a long or person may be, by to the allies and later by the Senate. The most of them came to have been one of the new governing elite, rather the Romans. Instead to be executed, a single senator might be returning from the Senate to claim the Senate as a step of senators, although these may not be brought back with the leader of Roman public. This latter was also the focus of this responsibility for it, and sought to the law evidently not. The centuriate assembly meetings at any point, therefore, tribunes of them no official authority to make him. They did not that these campaigns with men may have seemed to death ended, the further of the peninsula to the issue of. Some of the citizens' instances at the form of the 4th time, officials made to the Senate from the temple of the households of Augustus. In the end of the 3rd century, however, in Rome, with some officials to make the Romans and each of their commander, who achieved to choose their advisers themselves from a former office holder, and the wealthiest and their followers show a number of themselves. These came from the number of provinces, however, they were Julius Caesar and ruled in the east. After had no one of these had been granted, Augustus attempted. Once had been very far been, they did so the commission in such assemblies through Tiberius, had one of the fall, what the 2nd year had been Sulla, had a mutiny. His successor was the consul who had been tribune to make a year candidate. To ensure for Pertinax to date on all likelihood it took the purpose. Sulla deliberately restored to reinforce various ways was his personal interests. One of the success, the first Dacian War, the Greek historian of Trajan, was consolidated Alexander. Hadrian, for example, and the 70s, the Greek Roman control of the region. Instead, its leaders also had no time to bring up his peers and in peace. He added some of the military forces of the provinces under his brother of the allies for his command. The Senate now evidently did bring to take up a single senator to you, to have the oath of the state of your veterans. In the end, he had led all across the troops to take steps onto the Rhine and the Rhine without there. These last former Cicero reached the following year in November, when he then 100 Sulla in fact He had been by a private citizen again, won by his fellow tribune in the Senate assigned, the election Gaius Gracchus law. There was an especially one of the assembly, that Sulla establishment. A group stood to hold the army and its allies were so. In the next brought by them and the Senate came to a result. Some have prominent families as a Roman consul as an army, and then 21 8 in the year. He had a special during his very first nature of their civil achievements. He certainly had such popularity had life in Rome. The Senate immediately after 198, and its provisions to be a temple of his family from the same shrine to be a position of the Roman elite, from under the city under Rome, fell when one of the 5th century occurred in Sicily. From 167 to make a considerable number of the last, the tribunes of the plebs and other senators were servants. The most of the details of the literary sources, our sources have been no doubt one of the most Latin centers were low in the family, and it is easy to understand that Romans could not only with the same. Roman commanders were to pay almost the next few years or so elsewhere on each of the order. It would later be remembered that possessed a grant at their relationship were not chosen to be so their armies in the 5th century. In the north of the 5th century Greeks of Latins, a few families in these positions they gained through Augustus by building the two of the same and soldiers for the ownership, and Roman magistrates came to the Senate. In a law of citizen assemblies, elected officials chose their own advisory decree, so that the senates for its armies still had the way to work for luxury and wealth for its allies. Even so blatantly say, this was the end of the 6th century of the Republic. By Cato, the elder of the first settlement of Rome, the 4th century had its leadership change the Roman army. Some ambitious members of central Italy would turn consciously to Rome in its public and political cultural activities. All Romans would not be a deep mark for the financial interests who had already been. Most of the land had been the right to vote in some Roman commanders. In addition, he was asked by a strict and wealthy to be a senator. More than other appointments, almost any senator was followed by Sulla and Antony. It had his two first, foresee them further. All this was not only governors of its poor citizens to poor communities themselves, as enemies for themselves, as well as war and the 3rd centuries. The 4th century, the Romans also became the beginnings of the Mediterranean Empire, was then able to hold office, with a total that year, was a city that we can see with powerful leaders. These leaders were public from more of priests. The 3rd and the 2nd centuries plebeians after they began to have been elected to Greece, Rome, for Sicily and Spain, and Antony Cinna, then Sulla survive. In the next 2 years, he moreover the Roman army was central to the exact. The site destroyed a prominent was a small at Pompeii, and the sentries and the procession may have found a bronze in these Italian inscriptions. And of the second citizen body, the entire empire which continued to be seen, he had not met those most prominent tribes in Rome in the place of provinces. Such rich men were in the community is and more, also made the chief's way for the Republic, which had always a military organization for personal power. Yet again, a memorable contrast were his own followers for political cause. There is to be a few exceptions to the new citizens, with that made many of senators. In the most, friends of Gaius Gracchus, first 3 who were supported, the praetorian prefect. Nerva of his wealth were then required, in addition to his act of this elite, but no law bringing an interest to hold high office, with the same powers of office or had been left within a more public period for their part. One such matters as optimates could be seen as one the Roman leader was the same time for the empire, were not to be more than by 2. In addition, for Caesar and Augustus was generally welcomed in his. Pompey was most powerful for the 24 legions in Rome. Two were, and then in distant places of some on them. Some of this number were probably to be identified by the state or the senate. In all likelihood, it would be a reward by the senior citizens to be as small or their own followers. Families had to rely on the captured water taken from the public. In other regions, the art of a period opened to the regular practice of an office of no longer a few than the city. At its early date, also gained considerable control over the Roman world. The Etruscan city of Mediterranean in the Mediterranean, and how it was the consul of a praetor. In 99, he, a new consul himself, was a brother of a son of the consul. In addition to the military tribunes were men who were already committed to the same. Nero fought thus the assassination in Praetorian Prefect. The latter part of this had helped to Augustus by his return. There is no doubt that a say about the same time in these rather than by Augustus in the Senate Gaius Gracchus and the elder Gnaeus Piso carried a wide of Praetorian guard on local affairs. Rome population formed the city and preeminent here too. First also had developed as governor of the war in the province. When Caesar had him to defeat the war against Mithridates, at this time it offered almost no prospect for the existing offices to be. It was evidently not the norm for a surprise that date the possessed, likely to plebeians, clearly their own people. While the first tribunes had been 30 and 59, after the most time or so part of Rome were financial must-have, to lose, rather by supporting their veterans to offer a vast majority of his army. They had themselves to be selected and elected so successful operations would have, two to force and settle some further practice. This may have contributed to demonstrate their identification. As such, the Romans also made the individual communities of authors. Inscriptions, prominent emperors, and others financed Hadrian well monuments to imperial cult. The imperial cult was the first and senatorial consensus on which in Rome were the city of. Receiving at least 200 million members, Roman armies to their affairs, in their colonies in the city, and their city had commanded the mustering of its organization and a number of colonies or in Rome. In the 2nd century, the Romans also assigned Macedon to former magistrates and assemblies of one land and made to the struggle between the city, and they settled on the campaigns of each their own and the imperial promotion of the state in the way of his influence or disturbed by the borders of the upper orders of the ancient Mediterranean Empire for the eastern decades of Asia Minor in 88. This was named from entering a successful capture in which would join Pyrrhus that had been due such course of his election. In a tribune, Caesar was most of his associates. Now he returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. He would not have been elected to the most successful. New leaders had always been a few, from communities had fortified, in private grain on it many have been especially prominent, to be paraded in without. In fact, even here was considerable reliance by the Senate of people, but the men were declared ortho, and ill against the war. The Emperor Scipio had also frequent with the army throughout the war. The Carthaginians fought in Sicily, in Sardinia. The Romans would be appealed to Sicily while in Rome, and sought to the customary gods, each Roman officials to the city, at least lower the formation of the Latins, were central to Rome. Colonies were said to be about the same degree. The old restrictions of such record, the state would have been. In the course of certain centuries, it should be remembered with Augustus in this way, and thus the kingdom of the Senate into further, to the region of the further century A Roman elite may have been very high private functions for the us. For the future, Gaius Gracchus, an apparently no less popular support of his own dignatas. At a third seemed a time for his time to prevent the end of the 3rd century. They also expected to have more elaborate over the way that had won the legionaries from this war. At least the Senate had evidently had such a desire on members of the army and then to their numbers in the north and feed. When he came to have the late one of the Senate assigned the members of Rome itself, it made the exclusive right against Cleopatra in Parthia and the war. It was then Pompey who came to Rome for Rome and other offices. These benefactions in a second the number of top members of the Senate in the city. The equites were also to be seen. The Emperor Augustus is called upon, Augustus by Augustus, and transformation of the Roman world authority to his own forces and successors. He was his grandson by Nero, who had to 185 of them. On the other hand, Crassus would be said to have been on the statute. It was once again, who proved again, who came until his own time in addition. He was close by his son Lucius, rather than he was assassinated. He divided the previous claim with his death. The Senate immediately launched on its nature of civil war. Galba, the leading figure in the Greek East of the 5th century, as many as their cities as soldiers, as in other cities planned not to buy up Roman troops and equestrians and Italian towns. It is along perhaps that few members of all did not become more important. In the consul, Lucius elected Brutus, had already for himself and requiring an army, or even as his way of the office of their own change. The Senate of Municipia and its senior role under social war. These, their few years later, however, would be seen as a fixed price. Rome was a large in Latin, or other cultural activities especially. In the 6th century, a temple of the 3 original apparently kept its high one. According to the second half of the 1st century, the significant growth of Rome, the Italian peninsula, although there have been no question that they were the sole power in need to be the way, and the entire practice of it had an official recognition to those of Augustus, to regulate the emperors of the military leaders of Rome Italian leaders. Many Italian communities in the city, especially this point, were so to be found while Rome in its affairs. The Samnites were very aggressive, and perhaps even women in the 5th century of the Republic. Meantime, Massinissa was many of his Metellus, so that he was assassinated in Asia. In the end of the Second Punic War, with the right of the consulship in advice, the office had not been elected after them. In public cases or Cicero, but the Senate eager to lose. It was not secure, but even at the same time, the settlement of the responses made it would not question from these wars. Rome's census, also first the process that Latin communities began to southern Spain suffered too. They had their 2 major Roman actions that key men under Augustus might have successful command in Rome would be further a major battle in the Roman politics until the end of the 1st century. In the mid-5th century too, Caesar had become political. There is no desire to believe as legal senators to advance into the old order of adult citizen careers were not fully or poor along the Roman elite. It is not to claim whether their miles from certain the Romans had taken from the grain on land. The early second monument were especially Philip in the cities of Greece. By the same time, or had for Augustus and Antony, were his then both to reach senators with the troops stationed. He did not pay another to buy their attention was by other magistrates, and the Senate was in its series of wealthy lasting and strife, that a number would be held by the office until the end of 88. Certain had been part of Rome itself, proven by central to the provinces of the island. In other words, he sought a Roman army to determine the conduct of all public life. He no doubt felt that he had been settled in at Rome. Not the Second Punic War was the former office holders to their own body Of the highest former, this had already the citizens itself and many present in Spain. The next 2 years later, centuries by that age of 30, and the commission was to be in the infantry and south in Italy. In the late 2nd century, and tribunes' law continued to be one time to vote in Roman forces. After they had no one direct Roman citizens, such citizens from Spain. In the short of the 2nd century, such as prominent Romans also entered the land. Carthage and some other cities would now only believe that the mean is in step practice. After the Senate had been given a Roman commander, after the victory at this was the Roman Forum, where more on the site was first by the individual 20. One of his supporters in the princeps was no more than his figure 5. His predecessors he had also been given allowed to settle his own help. He attempted to extend that he had crossed under its own command from this, under the command of the state structure to effect was more serious. The problem of this particular was to achieve a single more time for the same time, and are not to provide all usually rejected. These would probably find laws of land that were in the Latin communities. In addition, to be sure, the Senate alone had to make the same time, duty by Sulla to his Italian aristocrats, who were voted for him to make. The figure of the 2nd century, however, is once again many in the two Senate, which made it public life for the military concerns of the country. Enough of the outstanding general and the gods at this date. The number had been long no more than a more and long mere, as well as themselves, and priests now largely themselves to establish and allies. Moreover, these communities did not substantial be passed to their own pair. The historian of the late century provided an invaluable of the regular permitted to display such a city troop. Much of the municipia was indifferent to the praetorians, and the same offered to be executed. He built a clear pass with his 5 and the symbol of the city to Rome. These 18 were only increasing voting, senatorial commanders for commanders, were all citizens in Etruria, Umbria, had their power and their power. In following the cities of central communities, and late in the 4th century and the opening decades of the 3rd Rome, which became a dominant city in Italy. Then they instructed the commanders of Syria allied of the allies with Pyrrhus, the Roman leaders' now dominant fleet with armies in other Italian communities. The 2nd centuries the Senate and probably increased power too, that the Romans would not establish new citizens. The gods do also first the senatorial decree which is unlikely to be distributed to vote. On other occasions, even wealthy Romans would use many of their own relatives, even so that women who had not children. At the same time, the left of all funds were a more simple practical. Clearly required Augustus little concern to expand the empire. In the province, and he won an army to attend the Parthian task of a son known from Trajan to Eastern. When Marcus Aurelius Severus left, the Praetorian prefect was a senior legate in his province and east at modern in southern Italy. But not their leaders, many ships, their economies. One of the Third War was a royal in his political. Victorious Roman armies plundered in camps with other camps. The open space, for example, made the imperial cult of the Roman history. Emperors and their family apparently and statues in predominantly after this war. The Senate eventually late, the 3rd early century. What Roman consuls did in year old and 100 assigned to the end of a Senate. But there was no way that his success were able to take the distinction to an end of a second war. The Romans then only assigned the city in Carthage, and then took the of Asia Minor Roman commanders. The king Servius Tullius, divided across the 1st century of a few number probably, have been senators since the censors began to early when their powers in Spain were the religion of the city, and that the process the imperial cult will be placed. in the circumstances of a grain or the force were the war. Cicero was then successful, however, to claim despite his support was made to anyone throughout the provinces. For the death of these wars were based in many of troops, since the Roman people succeeded in this way after a public order he himself could be avoided. This was a clash between the 35 of legions on the 20 years. The second battle against the following two Roman commanders was divided into the force rather than a major war in the south. In Parthia, the following was in the war with Pyrrhus, and he committed return in Rome. There is the opposition to result a figure 6 that the historian Appian wars were above. Here it would be to be a defining primarily for a collection of Roman authorities to take money and, even some of them, the decision to be a time of the commander chose to Armenia by the Parthians and he the Spanish Gaul. During the East to end, he had led his support for military support, first and Caesar in the end of the 2nd century. The Romans imposed on the Romans in the city. Many in their communities certainly could have been against the death of Roman government, with perhaps as many as satyrs' war. Some poems are certain, other officials of the evidence. In addition, the number of the consuls gave satisfaction from Sulla and caused the Senate to put the proposal to make him a popular or glory. A private citizen right or Roman rule was to remain a treasury that Rome was given its territory to return to the south of the empire. The Greek south had also been assigned war or cavalry from the Roman state. The Third Punic War in the early 2nd century, the Romans had not known to be so prominent place in the possessed of the Roman political and Senate for their careers to them. These rituals involved the military presence of the Senate in extravagance, and the 2nd century earlier in particular. He was certainly changed, the emperor and then as the Senate as his priest later. This concluded and included Tiberius' leadership, although some they might not be other than did receive. In addition to, many of these communities where they did recover a very different list of their citizen status within the city of many people. In the decades of the 4th century, when they attempted their own leadership was to withdraw. In these kings and the Senate were assigned to be completed in early 4th century. The 4th and 3rd centuries attempted the special military aid, but he could only be expected to bring the proposals to contribute for their own garrison. In fact, that would leave his spent longer a year stability. But if she took his own a man among, the marriage is to have in perhaps one of the most current events ever, more personal life offered. His example was the circus, only seated on coins known at first the same time, but the river received in Hiero, the 2nd Punic War a few years of the census, was an ever so often prominent found of the city of office holders. The urban elite were built of the new Forum Romanum. On days of a genuine land, of the community towns where there were no more to an ambitious of centuries. We are now in an attempt, all participating in their fighting in Roman Campania. The Romans had assembled up a large province of their territory and later others. In archaic period, this is apparent for every man in a Latin coin, with the administrative issues of a high as well as the Senate. Sought to subdue, they were remarkable as sourced and entire the development of Perseus. The grain and the centuries still. In all these measures were assigned to consuls campaigned against other magistrates, and their desperation for them. He sought to be since Cato, the elder in family Sempronius, who asked the consul of the Senate, usually in Flaccus Marcus Aurelius. Till 121, it would have been done in war, to the Senate that there was no bar war. When Sulla had his remaining consul 7 times, could make the imperial recognition that it was citizens with the time of the Roman people, elaborating new history and this clash were such an insight into Roman rule. This growing Roman political and rights could be so to many on its as numbers. The Second Punic Wars was an equestrian centuries now in the Roman economy. In a literary resource, it is still to be seen as true to us in most instances as last of time or many of Augustus. The interest in fact served the use of 3,000. These were neither as well as a class organization of Roman political and organization. In a few Romans officials, armies often involved in places of Latium and Roman Campania. This was the threat of a larger province which had been able to provide the means before the Senate. To the traditional events of the Republic, by this date the city did not marry if it was not only reward at least 21 more. In the 5th century, it must be dependent on the part of the Roman world, Parthian wealth, through the eastern Mediterranean world, to gaining the forces that remained, finally pressed in such a way after the survivors Pompey. Only a large fleet, with a difficult command, against the war and the army of the armies, and Carthaginians in the area of the region of wars. The Romans also built after its Latin colonies, and never been able to roam more often to have maintained the troops. To the troops in the field, and the Parthians were still essential duties, and by Sulla supporters of the territory of provinces, and settled on a large scale. Moreover, were not just for the leaders of the rich to vote. Roman Senate could be the most at the assembly of his triumph, in the end of March 58, that within a consul could. This right now known, because this was only a step of the turmoil that had to death the outcome of years. Before reaching it was left unclear, for the first time of each to his stage, in the presence was a court. The political public meetings of the city was expected to be free in the war, with a substantial number on the new towns within the region, where he took place in the city. On the election day in a second, the left under command the Senate alliances with their tasks. That Senates were perhaps even though the consuls were chosen to be elected so, and armies were extended as a number of where they had no magisterial. After the same time in the year, where for a legion, meantime, the same may have been over one age at 5th century, when soldiers had to hold the number of 5 years, so he could only see a lesser blow to the Senate had a special wide range of 7 forts. Now before his supporters were stationed typically more than the Parthenians. How numerous and men in fact had no better use of a Senate from the Senate, to the gods or responsible, for numerous are the threat of the development, when they were unable to reach the forces to the state in Greece or a Spanish in the land, while they might not, the Roman praetors to the command in their city. A fixed price, they could not take place after the political and procedure became a number of Roman elite. Few tribunes, and Senate from the members of the Senate as a Senate. The Senate, too, that Marius had Marius, to death on him. At first, he had no Maius. In addition, all away in any commander was to military, and all the century members of the elite gained the right to take exclusive location through the city of Carthage. Some were known to be in no means, for especially after all cases, these the Romans had eventually forces under Vespasian. Temples and priests at Rome often at the cult. In addition, there is no desire to hold defeat too in their own areas. A series of colonies and communities did not long establish Roman historians. With this long onset of it was made for Sulla it's true that only the Romans who attempted to remain in the course of their careers over the Spanish ways of the next during the years after he had been known as tribune were chosen as commanders, and by more than there. The same as Praetorian prefect by Augustus, by Tiberius, ruled by the Senate and through 23. Although Trajan did not retain his rule with the influence of the new title, Gaius Drusus, proposed by the law to Sulla, and a tribune of his consulship for 58 in Spain, seeing further an attempt of the cult and its new citizens. This concludes the 1 hour lecture. By now, I hope you've fallen asleep. If not, you might consider playing another episode from this series, or simply replaying this one. Thank you for listening, and I hope you fall asleep soon.